into the Football Guys Fantasy Football Show. I'm Alfredo Brown. Joined as always, I got Dave Kluge, and today we have a special guest, Matt Waldman, the author of the Rookie Scouting Portfolio, mostly known as the RSP. Matt, this thing has like 4,000 pages, bajillion words, and it is just a wealth of knowledge. Welcome to the show, sir.
I appreciate it, and I appreciate the hyperbole too. I mean, now we can make it sound a little bit more palatable at 1,250 words.
Oh no, it's very palatable.
Pages. Yeah, it is. It's a choose your own adventure, and there's lots of video links so that you can kind of see what I'm showing you about. And as Dave asked me, you don't, some people read it all the way through, but it's really a choose your own adventure kind of reference.
I actually looked into printing it out, and even at less than 10 cents per page, it was going to cost me over $100 to print this thing out. I wanted it in a spiral ring.
FedEx office was just looking at you.
Read it, and they were like, "No, yeah,
I did it.
Pricey to print it.
I did it once for an FSWA thing to see about maybe entering it in somewhere in a category. And after trying to spend the money to do it, trying to get it all set up, and it felt like I chopped down like an acre of trees. And then I got in a car accident on the way to send it off. I said, screw it, I'm not even sending this thing off. So I never did anything with it again like that. I mean, I looked at the glossary one day and it looked like a phone book. And I was like, yeah, I'm never printing this thing out again.
Yeah, Matt Waldman printing the RSP is the number one danger to the ecosystem here in the world. So thank you for that.
So thank you,
Matt,
Adobe.
Yeah, right. Matt, what I love about the rookie scouting portfolio and the way that you analyze prospects is you give us so much more context than we normally have. And you mentioned multiple times in the portfolio, you're not a big fan of rankings. So I'm not bringing you on here. We're not having you here to talk about your rankings and who's your top guy. But we do want to talk about some of your favorite players and the way they compare to previous NFL players. It's such a good gateway for someone who wants to know more about these players. Well, tell me who they could be at their highest level, their lowest level. And that's what you do in the RSP. And I think one of the toughest guys to, evaluate, even at this point, despite being so talented, becomes Travis Hunter, because we still don't know what position he's going to play, where he's going to get drafted. It's like trying to solve two Rubik's Cubes at the same time. So talk to us a little bit about Travis Hunter, the player comp you have for him, and where do you want to see him at in the NFL? Can he play both positions? Should he be a wide receiver or corner?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I don't really know how I feel about whether he should be a wide receiver or corner. I mean, I think from a fantasy perspective, we all want him to be a wide receiver. I mean, right. And the story. But then I think he's so adamant about wanting to be like the next Jim Thorpe or Sammy Baugh and play like two positions that I wonder how much that's going to influence defend coaches, and there are a lot of people who believe that he can be a better corner, but the market out there is really for the money for a receiver. So if they try and do both with him, are they going to end up making him more of a gadget type of receiver, or is he going to be more of a gadget corner, or can he really prove to everybody that he can do it all? And I'm skeptical. So let's say he's a receiver because the money's there to be the receiver, and they're usually picked almost at around the same time in the first round as often as cornerbacks. So you could say that the teams value both equally. For me, I look at him and I think about Ricky Pearsall and Chris Olave as players that, there's some people talking about Justin Jefferson and folks like that, but this is a 6 foot, 188 pound receiver. So, he's not a monster in terms of physicality, and he does get pinned to the boundary more often than people may give him credit for, in terms of, he can have people get physical with him and take him out of his routes at times. Doesn't mean that he's not going to fix that, but, it doesn't put him in a Justin Jefferson kind of, or Jamar Chase kind of category here. He can win the ball well. But he's very good at tracking the ball over his shoulder, beating people with his speed, running crisp routes that are, technically sound, and then making late adjustments to the football in traffic and do it in a way where it's not so much physicality as it is finesse. And that reminds me of what I saw from Olave and Pearsall in their games. I just think that maybe you get more in the open field than either of those guys, who are both good at it, but there's just an added layer of agility that Travis Hunter has that neither Olave nor Pearsall have.
And you talk about him getting pinned to the boundary. I feel like those are the plays that often end up being his best highlights because he's able to adjust with those late ball skills and make these unbelievable catches, even when he does get beat on a route. And I think that's what's so alluring about him. I don't know if you've seen this, Matt. This just came out this morning. It's been making the rounds, though. There was a quote where Travis Hunter was on a CBS Sports podcast, and they asked him, what would happen if you're drafted to a team that says you can't play offense and defense? And he said, I'd never play football again. I've been doing this for my whole life. I can dominate on both sides of the ball. He is literally saying that he will mull retirement if a team drafts him and doesn't let him play on both sides.
That's insane.
It is. He's eating a little too much of this red clay here in Georgia. He grew up down the way from me. He's like no more than 30. He grew up no more than about 30 minutes from where I live right now. And I joke that players from Georgia are a little different, and it might be that Martian clay that, there might be some sort of connection to that, maybe they're not really all completely from this earth, but that idea just tells you how serious he really is about being a two-way player. But I would have bet that there are coaches who will try to get him to compromise on that by saying, listen, we'll put you on defense, but let's put you in situationally, or let's put you in situationally on offense, or look, just to begin, they may test him by saying, let's just to start, let's give you one position to get better at, and we're going to let you do both, but we're going to put you on the field with this one position now. And once you get that under your belt, we'll start adding more of the other position onto it. And then that may never come, and we'll see if he actually decides, yeah, I'm going to hold my ground on this and threaten to retire, for that in that fashion. But yeah, I find that crazy. The boundary part that you mentioned is fascinating too, because it's like he can make some really fantastic athletic adjustments with that. What I hope is that, oftentimes when I look at boundary plays, I try and project, are they executing with a strong technique at the boundary where they time their leap, get their back to the defender, and they jump straight up and down. This is a jump up and through technique that you often see. Stephon Diggs is a great example of a small player who did it great, where he wasn't opening up his frame to a defender by jumping backwards or at an odd angle. They jump on time and early so they can get straight up and down. And that's where Hunter, sometimes you can see where maybe he could jump a little bit earlier on some of those. So it's really impressive on tape. It just may end up being he may have to adjust a little bit earlier with certain types of throws. But it's nice to, in the pros where maybe they're going to defend it a little bit better. But it is a good sign. It's a great sign that when things aren't pretty, he can make the ugly plays.
And I think the other concern, you talk about it, how coaches are going to view him. I think that's one of the most interesting things about Travis Hunter is that even if he comes out, let's just say, totally hypothetical here, the New York Giants select him at number 3, and Brian Daboll comes out and says, 90% of his snaps are going to be on offense, but we're going to sprinkle him in on defense here and there. And then what happens if Joe Shane and Brian Daboll get fired this year, and then they bring in a defensive-minded coach next year that says, actually, now we want this guy 90% quarterback with a handful of wide receiver plays. So even if we get what we think is a clear picture of his usage after his rookie year, his usage could change with every single coaching staff. So we could be looking at a drastically different type of Travis Hunter every year throughout his career.
No doubt.
So I actually think that's interesting, Dave. I disagree slightly, but I disagree because I think that we're finally going to see him. Whatever team drafts him early is probably going to try to make him play a lot of that one position. And this is going to be the first time we really see him focus on that one position. And I don't know that we've seen the best of Travis Hunter yet. If he ends up having to play wide receiver all year, a new version of Travis Hunter gets unlocked. It's already hard enough for these teams to install game plans week to week to then say, all right, we got a new head coach in here, new playbook. Also, you're going to learn a brand new position. I'm a little more optimistic. I think he ends up being a wide receiver, and I think he ends up staying there. That also might just be my fantasy brain forcing that on me.
Also, I think it's a lot easier to mix in like 8 to 12 snaps at wide receiver per game than it is to mix in a handful. Like I've never seen that before, where somebody's deployed as like a special package cornerback.
Deion Branch did it for a while with the New England Patriots, and they put him as a nickel corner, but I think it was a bit of a challenge for him for sure.
All right, next guy on here. This is another one that I think is very interesting because we've had so many examples of this player type. I I guess volatile is the word to use here, where it can be wildly successful for you or it can be a big swing and a miss. And Jalen Milroe is a guy that you believe, Matt, is not getting the love that he probably deserves here. Should Jalen Milroe be getting some first round buzz if he's not already? And who do you comp him to?
Well, I'll take a look at it from a different standpoint. I think most of the quarterbacks are getting more buzz than they deserve. And that if we adjusted everybody else, then Jalen Milroe would be and leave Milroe where he is. And I think that's really how I would look at it. That would be best, because if it were me and the NFL were thinking like I do about this, Milroe would probably be a second or third round pick, and everybody else would be third and fourth round picks at best. And would need
so
a
is
year
Jackson
to
Dart
come.
a guy like that where you think should probably be a third or fourth round pick in reality?
Absolutely. The guy's scattershot after 25 yards. I don't know what he's like a box of chocolates with his arm when it comes to 25-yard throws and over. Tracking that. Sometimes it's because he doesn't reset his feet well when he has to move in the pocket. Sometimes his feet look perfect and he still can't hit somebody. Wide open throws too. I mean, I've seen there's an LSU game where I've literally seen a receiver who's about to split two defenders in zone working across the field from left to right. And Dart has to slide over one step, and he doesn't even have to. He decides to, because he feels the push a little bit and decides to preemptively do it. Resets his feet not particularly well and throws that ball, forcing the receiver to break back almost another 10 yards to make the catch. If he caught the ball in stride, he'd still probably be running unless he ran into a swamp. I mean,
Part of me wonders with that Ole Miss offense, just how they scheme wide receivers up to be wide open. He was never forced to throw into tight windows. He was just throwing to wide open guys. So it almost seems lackadaisical the way he'd throw the ball, because a guy's just wide open on an island and he's like, I could just chuck the ball down there and my receiver will get it.
Yeah. So, I mean, he's, when I look at Milroe and think about this in this context, I think Milroe gets short shrift because a lot of quarterbacks of this type get short shrift. If you're uber athletic and you run like a running back in the open field and you play in an offense that emphasizes your legs somewhat, or there are players that this type of player, there have been studies that shown that they tend to get drafted later. They tend to get benched earlier, and they tend to not keep their job long term and don't get a second chance, when guys like Daniel Jones, who's of a different type, seems to get more and more and more and more opportunities to prove that he sucks. And that's just the way that I'll put it. But because I said it when he got drafted.
This brings up a whole nother thing, because Dave and I have had this argument. Does this mean are you team Anthony Richardson or team Daniel Jones for the Colts?
You think? But do I have to answer that one, or is it obvious? I mean, like, but
I just wanted you to agree with me on air. That's all.
Yeah, no, absolutely agree. I mean, I would think Robert Irsay would, in his, going through his midlife crisis and wearing hats sideways and dressed up like he's a part of NSYNC, might actually be a little bit more of an Anthony Richardson fan, but maybe not. Maybe this is just one of those deals where, he likes to dress a certain way, but maybe wants to be a little bit more staid for his Indiana constituency, and try and people please them a little bit. Or maybe this is just a whole big ruse to say, we want the fans to feel like that we had to make Anthony Richardson work for it a little bit. And if you can't beat out Daniel Jones, then maybe we really got to worry here. But no, I mean, I think that's the thing. So when you look at Milroe, he was probably one of the smartest pocket players I saw. He was the smartest pocket player I saw in this class. The way he moves in the pocket, he has quiet feet like Lamar Jackson did. In contrast to a Kyler Murray, who I always pick on because, he was like mid-career Michael Vick, where the minute he felt pressure, the head goes down, the eyes drop from coverage, the ball somehow goes out like it's a tail, as opposed to like him holding on to it somewhere, and he tries to make dramatic moves as a runner first, and then ends up like breaking whatever containment that his offensive line actually still had, forcing his receivers to reroute. And he makes a lot of pretty plays on ESPN. If you count, like, he has more pretty plays on ESPN than he has career wins. That's what I would say. And not that wins are important for quarterbacking for, ability, but it is important for them to be able to stay on the field as starters. And I have a lot of concerns about that. And Milroe will make small adjustments in the pocket, keep his eyes downfield. He has great feet on drops, something that Cam Ward, we may not know just yet how good his feet are on timing routes, because he's throwing 4 verts a lot of the time and RPOs and screens, and his drop back seems to be like someone who stutters. It's like 2 good words and then a pause and then maybe 3 more and then a pause, and you don't know what kind of volume you're going to, or what kind of pacing you're going to get with that. His feet, you got to see whether or not he can give coherent 5-step drops, 3-step drops on a regular basis. Not just like, so I think you look at Milroe, he's better in that regard with his footwork. And I thought he was the best at manipulating defenders in the middle of the field and underneath coverage, even with pressure bearing down. Plays that I would say are reserved for some of the best quarterbacks that I've watched over the years. So maybe the offense didn't ask him to do as much as some other offenses. Maybe the fact that Nick Saban left and the offensive line quality was a little bit more like Swiss cheese than it was like, in the past, and he was getting blindsided a lot. But my biggest concern for Milroe is probably that he's a bit of a he doesn't throw with great touch. He's not a good, he doesn't throw Russell Wilson moon balls very well. Things are on a line. He's got to learn to drop the ball in a little bit, but he's got the quickest, tightest release I've seen in quite some time. I mean, it's the most compact release in this game. Might be the most compact release of any quarterback I've seen who's currently playing. That includes the NFL. And by the way, he runs like Matt Forte in the open field. So, you could add that in there too. So this, academic Heisman winner, I have him very similar as kind of a mix of Lamar Jackson and Jalen Hurts. As a player who may need a little bit more time, like Hurts did, to kind of figure it all out, but has the quieter feet like Lamar Jackson does, has more of the build of a Hurts, but the speed of a Jackson, and I think is a better reader of the field than Hurts was, but not quite where Jackson was in the middle of the field. So if you could give this guy a year to sit, and I'd love to see him in New York. I think that'd be good, even if Daboll's leaving, just because he has 2 veterans, and Russell Wilson. You can pick from their leadership styles and mix and match. You can give Lamar, Winston, Jameis Winston. I would say scouts would say he was capable of leading people. People would follow him wherever he'd want to go. The problem is they're worried he'd lead them off a cliff. And but you could have Winston say, Winston probably has enough perspective now to say, don't do what I did back then, and Russ may not be the guy that people love from a leadership standpoint of a rah-rah guy, because they think he's a corny 80-year-old grandpa who belongs on a show with us talking about the weather, and spouting cliches. But how he prepares, how he handles, how he handles tough situations, how, you can get the best out of those guys, and really being a part of a room to see how all that work's done, because that's usually where the guys, all that bandwidth gets taken up, and then they look like, warmed over, on the field, early on. So it's Milroe, to me, I think, is a good combo of those 2 players and gives you the most upside. And I think that even as you see players defending Anthony Richardson, they're defending him because they're like, look, he's young. He's got, and what they don't want to say, because they're not going to throw their teammates on the bus, we're going to say our offensive line couldn't protect anybody, and our receivers dropped a lot of balls when he was in the game. And there's one game in particular, I think Houston, where they dropped like 8 balls. That would have been, he might have had a 300-yard day and 4 touchdowns if they caught everything that he threw. And I'm being conservative about some of those. So
And you talk about the athleticism, of course, with Jalen Milroe. That's the first thing that kind of pops out. But you did talk about the brains and the processing, and I think that's something that gets overlooked by a lot of people. I mean, this guy graduated cum laude in 2013, and now he's getting his master's degree, which I think he might have already gotten his master's degree. But I think that's the thing that gets overlooked. It's not just blind athleticism that you're betting on with Jalen Milroe. You're already betting on a guy who's a good processor that does have the athleticism and just needs to tweak a few things in how he throws the ball to take that step forward. What I've said a lot about Jalen Milroe is that I think if he was in a draft class 5 years ago, he'd be a unanimous top 5, top 10 pick, because that's when everybody was chasing the Justin Fieldses and the Trey Lances and the Anthony Richardsons, because we saw the success from Jalen Hurts and Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes and these really toolsy quarterbacks. But now, because over the last 5 years, we haven't had that same success in the draft, I think Jalen Milroe is the one that's kind of getting punished for this now and getting pushed down a little bit, where teams aren't willing to take that same chance that they were 5 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point, and the other thing that you might be able to add to that mix is that um, when it comes to processing is hard for people to study. The S2 is a perfect example of a tool that everybody started laughing about because of what ended up happening with CJ Stroud, in first year where he didn't perform well. Because oftentimes what happens is the league, from the people I talk to, there's still people who believe that about 60% of the league still values the classic pocket quarterback who's got a big body and a big arm, doesn't move unbelievably well, but if they do, it's a bonus. But they want the big school, the Bill Parcells bullet points. And, while that's a nice guideline from 30 years ago, Bill's no longer in the league, and the league has changed. And that doesn't mean that he wasn't a great coach and still isn't a great football mind, but it's kind of, it's evolved since then. And so, you look at some of these players. I mean, Patrick Mahomes, you mentioned, great processor. A lot of what he did that people said was risky actually was daring.
Mm-hmm.
It was calculated. And you could see that people said his technique and his footwork was awful. Then they started to realize that no, he's a shortstop playing quarterback, and the shortstop movements are all technically sound. He just borrowed from a different sport. And he actually is a very technically sound, very savvy player who rarely made mistakes. He just had the arm talent to be daring. And Anthony Richardson, you could see some of that with him, but the mistakes are bigger. He had less experience. And then when you look at guys like Lamar Jackson, the same thing. People didn't realize Lamar Jackson was doing VR every morning at Louisville in Bobby Petrino's offense, which, by the way, Tom Coughlin said was one of the best pro offenses around at that time. And he was doing VR every day, coming with his little chicken biscuit, and literally do VR every morning, looking up, simulating games. And people are talking about Jaden Daniels, but they didn't want to believe it until, Lamar's already had the success. So there's a lot of things that, are old points that are narrative that that become narrative that show that the NFL is still, kind of behind the times and how they evaluate this position. And, and they don't, and I'm a big believer that you got to give people intermittent playing time. Bryce Young is another latest example of a guy who's probably about to turn this all the way around, based on the fact that they benched him for a little bit and let him kind of let the game slow down and realize what kind of mistakes he was making by watching other players play. And, just from a management standpoint. And then when he got back in there, I mean, what he did to the Chiefs last year, taking them to the limit, and the way he was doing it against one of the best defenses in football and doing it at the line of scrimmage pre-snap. Mm-hmm. Dude, that guy basically made up for the S2. They like Bryce Young, but they hated CJ Stroud. It's a craft, the evaluation of these players. And so Milroe is one of those guys that's going to fall victim to the old school thoughts about quarterbacks when it's anything but the case.
And it's kind of crazy to think that in the year where Jalen Hurts and the Eagles win the Super Bowl, we see a quarterback who's comparable to him, and we're like, maybe not.
Yeah.
Maybe not. Yeah. Tahj Brooks is a running back that both you and Dave really like.
We do.
Someone else in the podcast, not so much, but that's fine. I want to hear what you like about Tahj Brooks, Matt, and the comps that you have for him. Because when I look at the comps, I see a lot of very different players on here, and I think that kind of fits Tahj Brooks because at different times he is a different player, and we've seen different listings for his weight, different ideals of his speed, where he's looked faster, slower. But one thing is for certain, he's got some really good agility in tight spaces. He's good at making defenders miss. So aside from that, or maybe you can talk about that, what is it that makes you love Tahj Brooks so much?
Yeah, I mean, when I first watched him, one of the things that I find very important about running backs who you're going to project as between the tackles players is that you want to see how they manage the game. Because one thing that the NFL has gotten right and learned about processing over the years is that they've discovered that the closer you are aligned to the middle of the field, the more you have to process information. And guess what? They were somewhat surprised that running backs had to have such good processing speed. And it's not just about making people miss or identifying the penetration or seeing where the open hole is. It's also about understanding the blocking scheme, the down and distance situation, what area they are on the field to know when they should take chances and when they shouldn't within the scope of the play and what's going to unfold pre-snap and early post-snap. So all of that is very much like, quarterbacking. So in those respects. So if you're backed up inside your black zone inside your own 20 and it's a second and 8, and there's a play where you usually would have the option to bounce a play outside, maybe you don't quite do that in a certain circumstance because now you've got a higher chance for 3rd and 13. The playbook is just completely shrunk. Your coach is mad at you because the plays that are probably going to work in the passing game, they can't even try based on how they've schemed and strategized here. And now they've got to run a draw play or a screen and hope for the best and punt. And so, that's why fantasy people loved Kenyon Drake and Marlon Mack, but hated old Frank Gore because he would take those two guys out of games and they'd see that speed and they'd see the potential for chunk yards and fantasy points. And they'd go, Gore's going to get me 3 yards. He's going to get me 2 yards. And he's getting all these touches. And it's just making me sick that I drafted these two speedsters inside of the 10th round as my third or my second back. And Frank Gore's getting most of the looks. What's the problem here? And it's that those two guys couldn't manage a game. And Frank Gore would take plays that were like plays that the defense was throwing lemons at him and he was turning them into lemonade. Either for the coach or oftentimes just breaking them for 8 to 10 yard gains where those other guys would have and Alfredo knows, you've seen Kenyon Drake ram his head in the backside of a lineman and get knocked backwards multiple times. And those are the types of plays Frank Gore would get 3 to 5 yards, maybe even a 15-yard gain out of, even though he wasn't fast. So when you look at Tahj Brooks, well, he was at Texas Tech, and Texas Tech oftentimes had an offensive line that basically was a lemonade stand, and the defensive linemen were basically a lemon grove, supplying all the lemons that they could throw at him. And this dude became an expert at turning that into lemonade. He could turn losses into smaller losses, mitigating losses, or turning them into gains. And even though he faced a lot of 6-man fronts or 5-man fronts, oftentimes he didn't have a tight end at Texas Tech that they would align in line as a blocker. I mean, Jalen Conyers oftentimes is going to be used as a receiver. So oftentimes the box counts were still advantageous for the defense. And so he's dealing with the fact that he could mitigate penetration, the fact that he could run through contact at 230, the fact that he could run around people. I watched him and said, well, he's probably not super fast, but I think he's got that Le'Veon Bell-like quickness. And I watched Le'Veon Bell. I studied Le'Veon Bell for the RSP years ago, and he was one of my favorite backs in that draft at 230. And his first year in Pittsburgh, the line wasn't great, had a number of injuries. Guys like David DeCastro had torn ACL, top pick at Stanford, one of their guards. And the next year, he had lost 15 pounds. His line got healthy, and he was an all-pro. And then when you look at Frank Gore and Le'Veon Bell both had very similar 20 shuttle times and 3 cone drill times. Very similar. And I thought, well, if Tahj Brooks runs anywhere near Le'Veon Bell or Frank Gore, that's what I'm expecting. And that's pretty much what he did. And he also lost the weight beforehand, so that you could get the speed up a little bit on the long speed end of the spectrum. And even when I went back and looked at him, I still saw enough where he's like, if you can beat linebackers and flip the field, go from the 40 to the 40 or even the 20 to the 20, you're doing fine. You don't have to be Ashton Genty in that regard, to be a good running back, especially with the volume that he could get. So you combine that with the pass protection skills, knowing how to strike people, using your hands, being able to stand up against box defenders and do that, reading blitzes at a high level. So he can get the hard yards. He can win in the open field and make people miss. And he's someone who can catch and block. When you put all that together, it wasn't hard for me to look at him and say, yeah, he's if he gets an opportunity, and his draft capital is going to be lower because he plays at Texas Tech, and NFL scouts
24 years
do
old too.
logo scout. He's 24, and they're going to say, oh, he's more of a fringe draft pick for us, even though the numbers might bear out that he'll get maybe a shot in the 5th or 6th round, but he's going to have to work for it. And that's why I like doing the RSP this way, because I don't have to combine logo scouting and draft capital and and follow around or call up, scouts and people I know to see what they think. I just can evaluate talent. And then when the draft happens, then I can spend time talking about where they get drafted and what kind of what kind of analysis we need to make of that.
And I misspoke. He's actually going to be 23, so not quite 24, 23, but that's ancient for running back standards.
Yes.
So I think that could push him down the draft board a little bit.
He's like he might as well be 30 in normal human years at this.
Well, that's like when we were talking about Ramondre on the last show, Dave, where I was like, he's sneaky old already, or he's 27, and it's just
drafted
like,
at 23.
Yeah,
same thing. It happens quick. When you get drafted at 23, you're over the age curve, by the end of your rookie contract. So it does happen quick, and I think that could push it down. But, Matt, you so eloquently said all the things that I really like about Tahj Brooks, but the biggest is that he's able to mitigate losses, and I think that is huge, that when he gets hit in the backfield, he can turn what would be a 5-yard loss into no gain, or what would be a 2-yard loss into a 2-yard gain. And just being able to pick up those hard yards is so important. And a lot of NFL backs can't do that. So he might not have that sky high ceiling we want in fantasy, because I don't think Tahj Brooks is ever going to be that guy who's backed up at his own 20, gets a carry, bounces it outside, and then is off to the races for an 80-yard touchdown. He's probably not that type of player, but he is the type of guy, if the opportunity arises, we've seen that he can handle a 3-down workload. And I think that he's got the size and the physicality to do that in the NFL too. So if that opportunity arises, he's a guy who could easily shoulder 250, 300 touches in a season and can volume his way into a really good season. The last thing I wanted to say too is that we've seen the workload in college. I just looked this up the other day. There have only been 2 running backs coming into the league that have had 1,500 plus rushing yards in back-to-back seasons. It's Omarion Hampton and Tahj Brooks. So we've seen that this guy can be productive. Sure, it happened at Texas Tech, but given the opportunity in the NFL, I don't see why his skill set can't be transferable.
Yeah, it's a great point. And see, also, when people used to make the argument about worn tread, what they don't understand is when you actually look at the statistical models, the more a player proves that he can handle a high workload in college, the more likely he's able to do it in the pros. I mean, Adrian Peterson, Ray Rice, Frank Gore, Cedric Benson, even. There are guys who were big load carriers like that. Marshawn Lynch, who proved that they could do it, in college. It happened in the pros. And yeah, I mean, Josh Jacobs. People keep wanting to, stick a pin in Josh Jacobs, and doesn't happen. James Conner. I remember being on air and having people say, "Oh, that Benny Snell Monday night, he just outplayed James Conner in that game, and he's done." And I remember making a video in response to that, like his demise was greatly exaggerated. The next year, he ends up in the Cardinals, and he's probably going to hold off Trey Benson at least for one more year. There's very possible that he'll at least force a split, but he held him off last year, as promising as Benson was, and he's the speedster with some size and power. And James Conner will just, he might be the reason why the Cardinals offense even has a shot.
Savion Williams. is the other guy that I want to talk about here, and I think he's a perfect segue going from running back to wide receiver because Matt, that's kind of how you have him here. And it's just funny because we were talking about Dave and I were talking about him the other day. I don't even remember if it was on air, off air, Dave. I don't, but like I just kept saying, like, I just want him to pick a position and be good at that one. And running back or tight end might actually end up being the best thing for him, or just let him be a Taysom Hill on someone's offense.
I mean, he was a
So
wildcat quarterback at TCU, played that a ton. And he
yeah,
was a high school quarterback full time. So, I mean, he really can do it all.
yeah. So, Matt, talk to us a little bit about this because you've got him listed as a running back in the RSP, and you've got him comped to some other running backs, but one that Dave has mentioned multiple times, and it's a great comp, Cordarrelle Patterson.
Yeah, I actually have him listed as both.
Oh,
I
you
have
do?
him as
Okay.
he's actually listed. He is my 11th wide receiver on my board.
Okay.
So he actually has a borderline starter grade as a wide receiver.
All right.
Now, when we note that, what I think is important is to know that, you know, the NFL, most of their starters have at least a borderline starter grade, if not higher. So that, at that, what that means is that if he were to go to a team and they're going to designate him a wide receiver, in a year or two, you could project that he would get an opportunity to prove himself. But when I watched him, I'll start with him as a wide receiver and say, to me, he's a better route runner than characterized. He is a good pass catcher who can get better. He is not Quentin Johnston 2.0. Okay, he has some drops, but Quentin Johnston has drops because he tracks the ball poorly and doesn't know how to use his hands. Whereas with Williams, it tends to be more of an issue of either focus, or he has some small technique lapses that are correctable. And the focus is correctable too. He's just looking forward to getting downhill and doing some damage. And a lot of receivers had that issue. Terrell Owens is a good example of that. The hands technique issues, Cortland Sutton still battles that, but he's still a pretty good receiver. And you can see him doing this type of work, making clutch plays against big time teams. Even last year and the year before. But whereas a runner is where he could be special, because when you watch what he does in the Wildcat and with gap plays on counter and toss and power, he has really good footwork. He understands when to cut plays back inside. He has a good feel for, getting skinny into tight creases. He runs through contact extraordinarily well. When you watch, hits are the hardest thing to work through. You got reaches, wraps, and hits in that order, and hits are the hardest to go through. And when you watch a BYU defensive tackle sprint 20 yards to the boundary, while Williams is fighting through a linebacker's wrap and pulls through just as the defensive tackle hits him in the side and slides off like he was like basically a cicada on the windshield of an 18-wheeler in middle Florida. You see that happen multiple times with his tape, and you realize that this guy is pretty savvy with gap plays, and the NFL runs a lot of gap plays now, because of these spread out defenses, and now they can kind of power through. So you look at all that and you say he could be what Cordarrelle Patterson could have been if Patterson had a better acumen for taking schemed info and coached info for game plans and implementing it without needing a lot of coaching week to week. And I think that that's where maybe Williams could be that. He may not be as good of an open field runner as Patterson was, because I don't think I think maybe Gale Sayers, Reggie Bush, and Adrian Peterson might be the short guys on that list. I'd argue were in the same tier as Patterson as an open field runner. But Williams is really good still in that respect. So it's up to the imagination of the team. And if I were the New England Patriots, who really they've moved from only picking slot receivers with reasonable skill, and to slot flankers, maybe you could say to them, look, Savion Williams, 6'4", 222, 4'4", 40. We make you a kind of that T. Higgins, Mike Williams type X with more skill in the open field. And we can also use you in the backfield and Wildcat with Ramondre Stevenson. Um, and we can use him a little bit more as that, fly sweep type of player, RPO type of player, and still get contested potential out of him as well. And if he doesn't work out as a flex, well, that old man that you got right now who's, at the ripe age of 27, you want to move on from him and let him go to a contending team for a year or two and still have a running back. You can just plug Savion Williams in there if the X experiment doesn't work out.
I think that's a great point. Just kind of talking about how he is a better runner between the tackles and in these gap schemes than people give him credit for. Because you talk about Cordarrelle Patterson, and that was the one thing. Like I see so many similarities in how they run and just their physical build and things like that. But Cordarrelle Patterson, when he'd get a handoff, he was still treating it like he was on kick return, like he was just trying to find any gap he could and just hit it as hard as he could. Didn't really have the nuance and the creativity to his running that Savion Williams does. I think the saving grace too with Savion Williams is we get kind of concerned when we see these positionless players because they often don't pan out in the NFL. But the way I look at it, I don't think a team's going to go out and draft him unless they do have plans for him. You don't bring a guy like this in who's probably going to go in round 3 or 4 and just say, well, let's see what happens. I think that whoever does draft him is going to have a developmental plan to make sure that they can get the best out of him. So depending on where he
You'd
falls, I
think.
mean, if he you'd think, but given
You'd
the
think the
draft
NFL
capital
does some
where
dumb stuff sometimes, but yeah.
they do, but looking at it, I mean, most people are projecting that he's going to go in round 3 and 4. That's a lot different than throwing a dart on a 7th round pick and just saying, well, if it happens, it happens. If you're investing a 3rd or 4th round pick in a player, I'd imagine that there's some sort of developmental plan. Maybe this is just me trying to talk myself into him not being a positionless player.
Well, I think that both of you guys made good points with that exchange because you delineated well the round points where the difference between we're drafting him and we have a basic plan of what we'd like to do with him as long as he shows up and pans out the way we expect, and the other we're just going to throw a dart and see what happens here. So I would say the 5th round is probably that demarcation point where you go, probably not. Probably just wanting to see what happens with them.
Mm-hmm.
4th round might be. 4th round, you're looking in, you're hoping that it's the case. 3rd round, I would almost say it's almost definitely the case.
Right.
Yeah, with a guy like Savion Williams, it's not even a thing where you're saying, "Oh, he's not good at football." You're hoping that this top tier ingredient goes to the right chef and they know how to implement it in their recipe. So it's like we've seen it, the Laviska Chenaults, the Treylon Burks, the Kadarius Toney, right? Like guys that have had the ability, they don't all turn into Percy Harvin and they don't get to do things in all different parts of the field. And so that's I think where I get most nervous with guys like this. It's not that they don't have a position, it's that do we now trust the new X factor that comes in is can that team help them find the position and implement them and unleash them the right way at that new position or at that singular spot?
And I think that's awesome too, because it's fun to be able to talk about those players with a little more context. But because on the surface, you're right. It's like they all are, positionless players who could do a number of things for you and be utility wise, where I would maybe look at some of those players and say, well, Kadarius Toney was a problem off the field. And we pretty much knew that. But on the field, when his head was on straight for all of a quarter and a half against Dallas, we saw what it could be, Treylon Burks couldn't catch a ball any better than Quentin Johnston could, and didn't know how to use his hands and really didn't understand how to run his own route, and get open for his quarterback. He didn't know when to stop. He didn't know when to continue. So he had a kind of a host of issues there. And then Chenault was basically held together by baling wire and duct tape, early in his career. So it's kind of you can now at the same time, we've seen each of the things that I gave context to with players who have worked out. So, you can make arguments to say that, there's been players who've been held together by baling wire and they had good 4 or 5 years in the league and were very strong. Guys who were absolutely awful off the field, but somehow they were able to put it together on the field. I love Steve Smith. I revere Steve Smith as a player, but the maturity factor with him was definitely very low, early in his career. And you you can see, a bit of the wild child still in him at this stage of his life, as astute as he is as an analyst, oftentimes. So yeah, it's just it's difficult to say, but I think that Williams, the fact that he plays two positions well enough that you could consider him a potential starter at either one is rare.
I think bringing up Steve Smith is kind of a perfect segue for another guy we want to talk about today, Isaiah Bond. Steve Smith fell into the round in the third round because of some character issues, and we have seen that some of these guys getting drafted a little bit later because of character concerns can pan out to be good NFL players. With Tyreek Hill and who else is out there? Antonio Brown and there have been a lot of guys, and now we're hearing Isaiah Bond was a guy that early on in the process, Matt. I know you kind of bury yourself away from everybody else's takes. But back in January, a lot of people were saying Isaiah Bond, top 5 receiver in this class, first round pick. Now with some of the allegations going around, as well as him kind of being a little bit of a loudmouth at the combine, now we're talking about him potentially falling late into day 3. So can you see a guy like Isaiah Bond, who I see have comp to Isaac Bruce and T.Y. Hilton, some pretty lofty comps? How do you see him kind of translating to an NFL field?
Well, I mean, if he can make it to an NFL field and as a starter, based on professionalism and the off-field issues that we've seen come to light, if all of that checks out enough that he's going to be able to be on the field, I like him a lot. I think he's the one receiver that you can look at pretty clearly and go, "Wow, there's some burst with the ball in his hand." I mean, that guy can move in the first 10 to 15 yards or in the first 5 yards. You see it palpably. Route running, he really is great at attacking stems and really accelerating into the top of his stem. And that's so important because there are a lot of speedsters out there who are like, when I'm not running a route that's legitimately a vertical route, I'm tipping it off because I'm running slower, or I slow down at the top of my stem because I'm not good at dropping my weight into breaks on routes that break back to the
They don't know how to
quarterback.
pace themselves through their routes instead of being able to make the defensive back actually get scared of your speed regardless of route.
That's right. Or they're not confident in their footwork at the break, so they have to slow down and raise their body up and tip it off. Whereas Bond, he can run breaks that break inside, outside, and back to the quarterback and use the techniques that you need with those that are very sharp, and he can do it accelerating into the top of the stem, which forces defenders to move their hips and get out of position. So Bond is very good at that. He has some minor catch point issues based on certain types of targets that are maybe thrown a little bit behind him when he's working over the middle, but nothing awful. He's very good at actually making catches and coming open late in the routes. And so when I look at him, yes, he could be your classic speedster. He could be your classic slot player, your big play slot player like D.Y. Hilton early in his career. But like Hilton, you could put him out at flanker. And if you really had to, you could probably put him at split end and let him run routes where he's going to win the comebacks. He's going to be able to uncover from a defender in tight coverage and win the ball up the boundary and be able to make plays on routes breaking across the middle of the field. So he's versatile in that respect. My biggest concern, again, is what do we make of the character stuff? And I would say this, it's, people, usually what happens from one year to the next in any draft is that when we see an error in judgment from a team about a player, especially at the same position, then we hear that player's name get bandied about to another player who's in that range. So Jermaine Burton, good example.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people are comparing him to is he a Jermaine Burton-like character problem, or is it below that Jermaine Burton line? And right now we would say it's above the Jermaine Burton line based on the fact that there's criminal allegations of sexual assault. But then if it's at the line of Burton, then it's more about, can he do his homework? Is he going to stay awake in meetings? Is he going to care? Is he going to do the work that's necessary to do that type of thing? And the thing about character with the NFL, and Alfredo, I'm sure you know very well, back in your days of recruiting and being a grad assistant doing work at FIU, that kind of work with, you've seen how NFL people come into organizations and meet with people. And there's a wide range of how people evaluate stuff, and it's just like hiring anywhere. Some people know what questions to ask. Some people don't have a clue. Sometimes the people who train you, they give you a list of questions to ask, and it's the right questions, but they let anyone do it and then make assumptions about what it is that they saw. Some person might go to the combine, like you brought up, Dave, which was great, and say, well, he shot off his mouth at the combine about what he was going to run. He was going to break the record, and he didn't do it. So is that a bad thing? Or are some people going to see it as a positive that he's ultra confident? And then they're going to, and does it depend on the layers of what you look at? The Chicago Bears saw Jimmy Smith and knew that he smoked pot. And this was before pot was legal in a lot of places, and said, we're teetotalers. We're going to take him off the board completely. The Ravens, I'm kind of making assumptions about how they think about this, but they drafted him, and I would say that the Ravens looked at him and interviewed him and said, "This is a good kid who consciously chose to smoke pot because it's probably, as we all know in the NFL, you have to be an absolute idiot to not pass a drug test in the NFL based on how they telegraph everything they're doing. So they know optics wise they can't condone smoking pot, but they make it very easy for NFL players to go, look, as long as we're not abusing it, and I can do my job, and this is my alternate way of having a painkiller with all the awful side effects that pharmaceutical companies have to deal with, what they manufacture with a painkiller. We're going to be okay with Jimmy Smith if that's the case. And they saw that and said they were okay with it. So that's the difference. I mean, the NFL, you just, that's the thing. I mean, I think so. There's a wide range of how this works. So if Bond, we don't know. We just don't know what it's going to happen. But I would say that if we're going to err on one side, when you've got criminal allegations, if it doesn't get resolved before the draft, which is unlikely it will be, he's going to be that 5th or 6th round pick that everybody knows is a massive talent, and they're just hoping that they got someone who's like, I'm going to prove to you that this was just a bad situation, and that I've had bouts of immaturity, but I'm going to grow up. And we've heard this story a lot, and it sometimes doesn't happen. But some guys are more characters than they are a character issue. I'd say Steve Smith was turned into more of a character. Chad Ochocinco was more of a character. Terrell Owens, as great as he was somewhere in the middle.
Brandon probably falls into that same Terrell Owens bucket.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like sometimes you just don't know, and you got to hope for the best. But Marshawn Lynch, total character, but definitely had character too, had massive amounts of character.
And you talk about Bond, Alfredo, you mentioned it, him like not tipping off his routes. There was a funny video going around recently. I don't know if you guys saw this. Todd McShay was sharing clips from Texas offense to highlight Matthew Golden, talking about how nobody moves like this guy, nobody's as fast as this guy. And Jetpack Galileo over at the FF Astronauts quote tweeted it and said, what about that guy across the field from him who's running the route even better? And when you look, where they're highlighting Matthew Golden, Isaiah Bond is running a deep curl on the opposite side of the field, gets to the top of his stem breaker, comes back quicker, and gets more separation. So he's kind of been the forgotten guy in this draft class because of all of the outstanding circumstances going around outside of football, but definitely a name to watch. And we don't need to list them all out, but you kind of know the teams that are willing to be a little bit more risky with their draft picks and will take on these character concerns. And then the other franchises that'll stay far away from them. And it seems like it's a lot of the good franchises, the Chiefs, the Ravens, the Patriots, that
they have an ecosystem
bringing these guys in. Yeah, hoping they could bring him in and set him on the right path.
Yeah, I'm glad that Jetpack Galileo saw that before I did, because I would have been tempted to do the same thing.
I'll send it to you. It was a good clip. Yeah,
I have Golden 3 and I have Bond 4, but the only difference it's the route running I have graded higher for Bond than I do for Golden. So there's not much of a difference. In fact, it's 0.2 of a point. separating those two.
Oh,
So
wow.
the way the combination worked out, Golden was just slightly higher. But if someone said, I'll take Isaiah Bond every day, all day, just based on ability, I wouldn't argue with them, even if it's, he's just slightly lower on my board.
Yeah, I've been a big Isaiah Bond supporter throughout the early process. And then kind of as things go on, you start to hear the rumblings of, oh, he might be a character concern. And you're like, okay, well, I don't even know how to value that if I'm trying to put something together for Dynasty football managers. Like, you look like a fool if he's one of your top 3 receivers and he's a guy that gets drafted in the 5th or 6th because of allegations. So you try to balance that out. But I think this gives great context to the player, because the player, when I watched him, Matt, I saw a Jalen Waddle-esque guy who sometimes also has problems at the catch point. It's also not fair. They both went to Alabama and almost looked the exact same in terms of their gear and the dreads coming out of the helmet. But it was just it's the same thing. Isaiah Bond and Jalen Noel were the 2 guys that when I put on the film to watch them, I was double checking the speed settings that I had the playback on, because you go to double check. It's not at 1.25x. You're actually watching these guys run this fast. So when he's out here running, he ran 4.39, right? Isaiah Bond at the combine.
Which is a great
and
speed,
everyone,
but because he said
and everyone was
record,
listing him as a loser. Everyone
Right.
listed him as a combine loser after running a sub 4.4. I think a lot of it does become perspective, and I think we're going to find out a little bit more about that perspective as things start to get unearthed here as we get closer to the NFL draft.
Yeah, I mean, it was probably it was just a size different. It was like literally a sigh of a difference between him and Matthew Golden.
Yeah,
a tenth of a second. Okay,
changes a lot of people's mind.
It does. Remember Saquon Barkley and Nick Chubb? I remember people looking at Saquon Barkley and Nick Chubb, and not that Chubb was even thought of being in the same universe of that, on draft capital standpoint. But they really weren't all that different in terms of the stuff, in terms of the times. But I saw comps to Nick Chubb that were like broken down Frank Gore, like pre-draft, and I remember seeing a former Giants line cornerback. I think it was Will Blackman. I remember seeing him on Twitter going, "Yeah, that guy can't play." Like it was like in the preseason against the Giants, and just talking about how that he didn't just thought, yeah, this guy's not really going to ever be much of a running back.
Since
so
we're
it
talking
happens.
40 times, this is something I'm sure you already know, Matt, but there's actually data to support it now. Somebody went through and looked at all of the drills from the combine and which ones, translate most to NFL success for different positions. And, flashing back to what we were talking about with Tahj Brooks earlier, 40 times mean almost nothing for running backs. I mean, the ability, how often do you actually see a running back run 40 yards in a straight line? It's very, very rare. It's the 3-cone and the shuttle drills. The better running backs doing that has the strongest correlation to future production. So
I've been scoring it that way for at least 15 years.
Well, now you can know that the data from just last offseason corroborates what you had deduced 15 years ago.
There we go.
Well, guys, I think that's going to be a wrap for us. We were able to discuss 5 of, I think, the most interesting players in this upcoming NFL draft. Discuss a little bit what we think about their player comps, and I kind of just want the draft to be here. It's enough. It's like we're waiting for our food. I've had enough appetizers, man. Give me the entree. I'm ready to go. As always, I want to thank everybody for watching and listening all the way through. Matt, thank you so much for joining us today. But we're obviously going to have you on next year and every single year after that for the NFL draft. Of course, we have to. Dave, we'll be back again on day 2 of the NFL draft doing the live stream. So everyone that is checking out this video, we hope to see you back again over here on the Football Guys Fantasy YouTube channel, where we're going to be live streaming rounds 2 and 3 of the NFL draft. For myself, for Dave, for Matt, we'll see you next time. Adios.